normally when I go to talk to government leaders and CEOs of big corporations about the future and about the idea of us living to 120 or more, I spend most of my time trying to avoid them going into cardiac shock or to close their mouths as their jaws drop open. But luckily, we've had two brilliant scientists show us truly convincing data about why this is now possible. So what I want to do is to get you now to step back and think about, what does this mean for society, for the individual, for government, for work, for the whole way economies run, and what it means for our planet if we can reasonably expect to live to 120 or more. And I'm going to draw on two things, really. One is a book we did last year which explored the science and technology that's shaping the future of business. And really a lot of the things we've heard about now. 62 contributors from around the world sharing the most cutting-edge thinking about how our world will transform. And the second is one we're working on right now, which is how do we avoid that science and technology driving us? How do we make sure that when we talk about the future, we put humans at the center of that story? So I'm going to draw on both of those. And one of the things we can see is that it's not just aging, that there's actually a silent revolution taking place, a revolution that the musician Gil Scott-Heron talks about not being televised. It's being broadcast on Twitter. And there are a combination of factors coming together. So we can't just think about aging, we actually have to think about how a combination of forces are going to transform our world. Firstly, there's a set of science and technology developments that are moving exponentially. We've seen them all the way through this conference. We see them in the government edge sessions. We see them in the Museum of the Future across the way. Science and technology developments that are not improving 5 or 10% a year, but are improving exponentially, doubling the rate at which we can sequence a genome, doubling computer power, trebling the rate at which we're able to 3D print. A whole range of these developments that will reshape our world. Those in turn are driving the potential for truly game-changing development. So yesterday, we heard about Hyperloop. If you weren't in the session, you missed something truly amazing. We're talking about a transport system that would take you from Dubai to Abu Dhabi in less than 15 minutes. This is the kind of innovation that's happening in our world. At the same time, we're seeing these new industries give birth to totally new thinking about what a business could look like. Outside, you see that driverless car. The people who are bringing these things to market are not talking about creating jobs at the same time as they're creating new industries. We're already seeing in Silicon Valley the idea of unicorn companies, companies that are worth $1 billion within 2 years of being formed, and they've only got 10 employees. And now we have the decacorns, who are worth $10 billion, and they've got less than 20 employees. Recently, we've seen Uber being valued at $70 billion, more than Ford and General Motors combined. Anybody know how many employees Uber has around the world? Less than 1,000. It's the biggest taxi company in the world that doesn't own one taxi or employ one driver. So we're seeing a fundamental shift happen. We're seeing people talking about creating new industry, creating new wealth, but not necessarily creating new jobs. And the biggest game changer of all, and we've heard this, you're seeing the IBM presentations, artificial intelligence, technologies that could emulate and at some point outperform the way humans think, that could replace us in everything. We're already seeing AI replacing doctors in cancer diagnosis, or outperforming doctors, outperforming bankers, outperforming lawyers. I talked to government leaders who are saying to me now, our understanding is that it costs about $1 million to train a doctor to a standard where we could trust them in a hospital. That doctor then receives a salary of about $100,000 a year. I'm now being told, that government leader is now being told by the scientists and technologists that within 3 years they'll be able to have robots which cost them about $50,000, and for a $1,000 update fee each year, will basically be able to do about 80% of what that $1 million trained doctor will do. And they're saying, what choice should I make going forward? What choice should I make for humanity versus what choice should I make from an economic point of view. So we have all of these challenges coming together. Within 5 years, when we talk about the workplace, it's not just going to be people. It's going to be enhanced people using some of the science and technology we've heard about, enhancing our mental capacity, genetically modifying their bodies, extending their life expectancy. All of this is going to populate our world. To what extent are we thinking about that when we plan for the future? And what we see is with the advances in artificial intelligence and robotics, people at Oxford University estimating that anywhere between 40 and 80% of all the jobs that exist today could disappear within 20 years. So on the one hand, we could be living much longer and have the physical and mental capacity to work to 100. But on the other hand, where will the jobs be? What kind of jobs will they be? How will we architect society so those people aren't literally bored out of their brains or unable to feed themselves? And so we have, from the kind of massive global challenges to very personal ones. On Monday, we saw the oldest Emirati pass away, 107. That is going to become more and more common. What we see is even without the science that these guys have told you about, human life expectancy is rising. I come from the UK. Average life expectancy is over 80. It's going up between 2.5 and 5 months every year in most developed countries. So a child born today has a reasonable expectation of living to 120 and having the physical and mental enhancements to enable them to physically work to about 100. But there are some real underlying challenges here. For example, if you are going to live to 200, how do you motivate a 150-year-old doctor? What do you buy your partner for their 190th birthday? And think about marriage. When we say yes, some of us struggle with the idea of accepting a deal that lasts 60 years. Imagine making that commitment and being bound together for 130 or more. Would we make divorce compulsory after 30 years just to keep the murder rate under control? We're entering some very new territory here, and we have to start to think about how we're going to deal with this as an integrated view of how we plan the future of society. And there are some challenges here because the big business is really seeing the value of life extension. We've heard about Peter Diamandis, Google, all sorts of companies investing in the science of life extension. Very recently, a group of scientists have had approval to look at how you can use metformin, which is a diabetes drug, and to look at its potential impact on extending life expectancy. In various animal trials, it's already been successful in extending life expectancy by 50%. If the same happens to humans, then we're talking about, looking at the guy who you work next to and thinking, oh my word, I've got another 40 years of sitting next to you. We're in an interesting space here. And this is going to change all sorts of things. For example, societal attitudes to work. Right now, we assume it is absolutely natural that you and I will go to work, that our children will go to work. We generally expect that that's what you do. You work for 50, 60 years, and then you retire, and that's what a good citizen does. Those who can't work, we provide some sort of social support for. But what if it's only 30 to 50% of the population that have full-time employment? What if actually it's not the norm to go into work? How will we change the attitudes in society, the conversation in society, to say, actually, you have to prepare for doing something else for most of your life? How will we value elderly in society? In some societies, we place great store on them, we value their wisdom, and we look to our elders. But how do we decide which elders we're going to look to if we've got the over 80s, the over 90s, the over 100s, and in the case that Brad's talking about, the 200s? Who has most authority in society when you've got those people? And by the time those people reach 120, what we also know is we'll have uploaded our brains to the internet, so we'll be able to access the memories and the thought processes of the generations who've gone before. So how deep will our consultation be of expertise and wisdom and the elders in society when we can even access the people who are dead? We're also going to have to think about, well, what are the jobs going to be that we need for the future, and what are the skill sets going to be? We heard a very passionate presentation yesterday in the education session that said, we need to stop training people for the basics. learning languages, learning mathematics, learning information, which we can access on the internet. We need to start thinking about different skills, because someone born today, or someone going into the workplace today, can reasonably expect to have 6 to 10 different careers in a lifespan, a working lifespan from 20 to 100, and they might do 40 different jobs. So it's crazy to have an education system that's training you for a specific job when we have no idea what that job will be in 10 years' time, let alone 50. We have to have a fundamental shift that starts to think about what are the skills that will be transferable. So one is accelerated learning. How do we help you learn quickly when you need to learn new skills? Problem solving, thinking in scenario terms, so we don't just think in a fixed way about the future, but we think about a range of possibilities. Collaboration, problem solving, negotiation. There's a whole different set of skills that we need to start thinking about, not just equipping children with, but the adults of tomorrow. And starting to get people used to the idea, particularly teachers and the schooling system, to say you are training people for jobs that we haven't even considered yet, for industries that don't yet exist. So how do you know that you're teaching them the right technical skills? What you need to teach them is the skills that will enable them to navigate the world, whatever comes next. We also know that, some of the things that are being heralded by the Silicon Valley people as the future present their own challenges. So, for example, they're saying, well, actually, it doesn't matter. You can get a job being an Uber driver, you'll rent out your spare bedroom using Airbnb, you'll rent out closet space to Amazon as local storage, you'll let somebody park on your drive for some rent, you'll share out your computer in a shared computing system, and maybe you'll go and paint someone's house in return for them looking after your children during the day. Now that might sound attractive to some people, but if I'm that lawyer who spent literally $1 million getting myself educated at Harvard, being an Uber driver may not be the extent of my ambition. And what we know is that there's not universal acceptance of those jobs. Everywhere around the world we've seen protests against some of these sharing economy businesses because they changed the rules. Uber has challenged the taxi industry, Airbnb has challenged the hotel industry, and they're fighting back, and the legal systems are fighting back. And we also know that these won't be around for that long themselves. Uber has already got the biggest single team in the automotive industry working on self-driving cars. So within 5 to 10 years, those cars you see outside could be taxis driving themselves. How many people will be required for that then? Everything that we see today as being a skilled job or a job that requires human judgment, intuition, imagination, could potentially be replaced by artificial intelligence and robotics. So we do have to think very deeply about how we're going to structure the economy and shape that going forward. We also need to think about, well, how will we shape the aspirations of an individual in society? What will we guide them to? What will we say to someone about what a fulfilling life looks like? Today, it's fantastic in the UAE. There is this, built into your DNA is this idea of aiming for the stars, going for the most incredible dreams, and then, giving yourself permission to actually do the things that will enable you to do it quickly. But what if the UAE becomes the exception? What if around most of the world, most people can't get to those aspirations? That there'll be so few doctors, so few lawyers, so few advanced engineers that most of us won't be able to get those jobs. How will we tell people what they should be aspiring to? How will we tell people, what will we say to them about what a fulfilling life is? Maybe actually being in permanent education, maybe being an artist, maybe being a performer, maybe what we aspire to. How does that fit with our current cultural values, our current education systems? What most of us may be doing gets almost no space in the current agenda. So we're talking about a fundamental shift in the way we think and behave. We also need to think about the way we're going to deliver education in the future. Technology plays a big part, but also some of the soft skills we're going to be teaching our children to help them survive mentally and energetically are going to be very different. So I'm very passionate about this. I spend a lot of time looking at how school systems are changing. And two of the biggest single improvements that are coming in children's performance in school and driving down the level of conflict in schools and driving up children's attention One is teaching our children how to sleep, how to prepare themselves for sleep, and the other is having them do daily meditation. Very simple things that actually allow them to tune into themselves. So we're going to have to start thinking about what is that total combination of things we need to be teaching in children in schools, not just the academic subjects. How do we make sure we're preparing them to navigate an uncertain and constantly changing reality? We talk about retirement. Pension systems were invented by the Prussian Chancellor, Bismarck, in the 19th century. Anyone know what the average life expectancy of a Prussian was in the 19th century? 46. Anyone know what age he set the pension age at? 70. The guy was a genius. Right? He worked out that on average no one was going to come and collect. That is a brilliant economic model for a pension system because you never run out. Now we have, on average, pension systems, people retire between 65 and 70, and they're living on 10 to 20 years beyond that. Everywhere around the world, the pension system is broken except Australia, where they've been making people put 15% of their income into pensions for a long time. But what we know is the model is broken. It's a bit like there's a dead elephant in the corner, and everyone walks into the room, sees there's a dead elephant, says, oh yeah, there's a dead elephant, let's ignore it, or put a blanket over it, put some perfume on it, and pretend we can't smell it. But the reality is the elephant is dead, and it's smelling more and more. And we need some fundamentally different systems. So, for example, if I am going to live to 120, A, my kids are very depressed about that idea, but B, they're going to be 100 before they get to be free of me. But B, we know that actually I might work for a few years, retire for a few years, work, retire. I made the conscious choice at the beginning of this year that on average I'm going to do a 4-hour day. I'm going to manage my work in 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time I'm spending developing myself, resting, having fun, because I don't want to get to the point where I'm working myself crazy and then suddenly stopping and doing nothing. And so actually making sure you're capable of living that kind of lifestyle becomes critical. And so we have to start to think about how pension systems will change and how you might take the money out all the way through your life rather than just at the end. And how we start to change the way we put money in, maybe putting a lot more in at the beginning and less as you get older. We're going to have to start to have some really radical thinking about how these things work. We also need to start thinking about, well, what are governments going to do in terms of creating jobs? What are the sectors we're going to focus on to actually drive job creation? What's our role going to be as governments in encouraging entrepreneurship, encouraging people to create their own jobs so they have more protection? Because what we know is big businesses are automating, and they're never going to be creating the same volume of jobs as they've been creating in the past. One of the biggest challenges we face around all this is if we have a permanent group in society who aren't earning money or who are earning very little, how will they buy the goods and services they need to feed their families and keep their families alive? And where will the money come from for the companies that are producing goods and services using the robots and artificial intelligence? So around the world right now, there is a massive discussion going on about the idea of a universal basic income, guaranteeing a certain amount of money to every citizen. Canada's been experimenting with it, Namibia, the Netherlands, now Finland. A number of countries are taking very seriously the idea of rethinking how we're going to make sure that society functions effectively. This is going to have a massive impact on societal systems. In democracies, we already know that the working population is aging, the voting population is aging. In the UK, the average age of voters in the last election was over 50. Now, the over 50s don't necessarily vote for issues that are of interest to people who are 18 to 25. And if we're going to get older and older as an average age of voters, that is going to change the way we think and the way we vote. It's going to change things like healthcare systems. We've already heard about this. You could live to 120 but live a very unhealthy life. The cost to society will be immense. So we have to start to think about how we change the way we think about what we're doing as a society, the way we make decisions about where we put resources in society, what we invest in, and how we make sure that the social systems in society are sustainable if people are going to live 20, 30 to 50 years longer. We also need to think about what individuals are going to do for themselves. Most of us think about 80, maybe living 80 to 90 years. And mentally, we prepare ourselves for stages of life and on a changing role, from being a child to being a teenager to being a young person to being a kind of productive worker to being a parent to being a grandparent and then being an elder in society. But what if we're adding 40 years to that? How mentally do we prepare ourselves? What if we are living to 200? I mean, do we technically have our memories wiped out just so we can create new ones? How will we kind of structure things in our minds to make sure we don't lose kind of context about when things happen and make sure that we kind of stay present to what's going on in our world? All this creates a fundamental set of challenges for government, which is not just how do we think about an aging society, but how do we think about our society in the context of everything that's happening? The changes in technology, the changes in business, the changes in the way our systems work. We have to start thinking in an integrated way. Now, I think you're very fortunate here to have made the investment, or very wise to have made the investment in the Museum of Future Government Services that is letting you think about some of those things. But wherever we are in the world, I would say, what mechanism is your government setting up to explore those forces shaping the future, to imagine new possibilities, to experiment and prototype, and then create mechanisms to scale up and roll out those new systems in society, and to do it quickly? The real challenge is, how do we go back and make this part of the conversation from tomorrow? What's our game plan? Because we are not going to get to the future doing the things the way we've always done them. I think the UAE is very fortunate because you've always given yourselves permission to think the unthinkable. But how do we think the unthinkable about a society that could be living to an age of 120 in a world where work will not be the norm? The author Graham Greene says there comes a time in everyone's life when you have to open the door and let the future in. I think here in the UAE, that door is always very firmly open. I hope myself and the other speakers have just given you a few thoughts on what sits on the other side of that door and how we start to wrestle with the challenges and opportunities it creates. Thank you.